Have you ever wondered what true heroism looks like? Sometimes it doesn't wear a uniform or carry a medal. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner, unnoticed by the world, carrying secrets that shaped history itself. Today's story will change how you see courage forever. If you believe real heroism doesn't always wear medals, subscribe. This is a story the world needed decades ago. Here on our channel, we tell stories like this, hidden, true, transformative. Subscribe and stay with us. The morning sun cast long shadows across the National Mall as Eleanor Hartwell adjusted her worn leather purse on her lap. At 87, her hands bore the telltale signs of a life lived fully. Weathered fingers that had once moved with precision and purpose, now slightly trembling as she clutched a small, faded photograph. The bleachers around her buzzed with excitement. Families had arrived hours early to secure prime viewing spots for the Veterans Day Parade, their children waving miniature American flags while parents chatted about their military relatives. Eleanor sat alone in Section C, row 15, seat 7, the same seat she had purchased for the past 12 years. "Excuse me, ma'am." A young mother with a toddler on her hip approached Eleanor's row. "Is anyone sitting there?" She pointed to the empty seats surrounding Eleanor. "No, dear. Please, sit wherever you'd like," Eleanor replied with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The woman settled in with her family, immediately launching into animated conversation with her husband about their son's upcoming deployment. Eleanor listened quietly, remembering another time, another war, when such conversations carried a different weight. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant aroma of food vendors. Eleanor pulled her navy wool coat tighter around her shoulders, the same coat she'd worn to these parades for over a decade. Pinned to her left lapel was a small, tarnished silver brooch in the shape of a caduceus, medical wings barely visible unless one looked closely. As the crowd continued to grow, Eleanor found herself studying the faces around her. Young couples taking selfies, elderly veterans adjusting their service caps, children bouncing with anticipation. She wondered how many of them truly understood the cost of the freedom they were celebrating. Her weathered fingers traced the edge of the photograph in her purse, a black and white image of 12 young women in military uniforms, standing proudly in front of a makeshift medical tent. Their faces were serious but determined, eyes holding the kind of resolve that only comes from witnessing the unthinkable and choosing to stay anyway. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. "Welcome to our annual Veterans Day Parade. Today we honor all those who have served our great nation with courage and distinction." The crowd erupted in applause. Eleanor clapped politely, her eyes fixed on the far end of Pennsylvania Avenue, where the first units were beginning to assemble. Marching bands, veterans organizations, active duty personnel, all preparing to march past the reviewing stand where dignitaries sat in comfortable chairs with perfect views. "Mom, look, the soldiers are coming." A little girl, too, rows down, pointed excitedly as the first formation appeared in the distance. Eleanor's heart began to beat a little faster. She had come to these parades not for the spectacle, but for this moment, when the active duty units would march past, their young faces reminding her of others she had known long ago. Faces that had looked to her with trust, with hope, with their last breath. The morning sun climbed higher, warming Eleanor's face as she watched the procession begin. High school marching bands played patriotic songs while veterans groups waved from converted vehicles. The crowd cheered and waved flags, their enthusiasm infectious. But Eleanor remained still, her eyes searching each military unit as it passed. She was looking for something specific, though she wasn't entirely sure what. A recognition, perhaps. A connection to a past that sometimes felt more real than the present. As the parade continued, Eleanor noticed a young soldier in the crowd, a woman in dress blues who had been watching from the sidelines. The soldier's eyes met Eleanor's for a brief moment, and something passed between them. Recognition of a shared understanding, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of one service member to another. The soldier began walking toward Eleanor's section, weaving through the crowd with purpose. Eleanor watched curiously as the young woman approached, her military bearing evident even in civilian surroundings. "Ma'am," the soldier said, having climbed the bleacher steps to reach Eleanor's row. "I'm Sergeant Maria Rodriguez. I couldn't help but notice your pin." She gestured respectfully toward the medical caduceus on Eleanor's coat. Eleanor's fingers instinctively moved to the brooch. "Oh, this old thing. Yes, it's from a long time ago." "Were you a nurse, ma'am? In the military?" Eleanor studied the young woman's face. Earnest, respectful, genuinely interested. So few people asked anymore. So few people even noticed. "I was," Eleanor said simply. "Vietnam, 1968 to 1971. Sergeant Rodriguez's expression shifted to one of deep respect. "Ma'am, my grandmother served in Vietnam too. She was a nurse. She always told me that the medical personnel were the real heroes over there." Eleanor shook her head gently. "We were just doing our jobs, dear. Nothing heroic about it." "With respect, ma'am, I think you're wrong about that." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of marching boots grew louder. The active duty units were approaching, their formations precise and proud. Sergeant Rodriguez glanced toward the parade route, then back at Eleanor. "Ma'am, would you mind if I stayed here for a few minutes? My unit is coming up soon, and I'd like to watch with someone who understands what it means to serve." Eleanor nodded, touched by the young woman's request. "Of course, dear. Please sit." As Sergeant Rodriguez settled beside her, Eleanor felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. For so long, she had been just another elderly face in the crowd, invisible and forgotten. But here was someone who saw her, who recognized what the small pin on her coat represented. The two women sat in comfortable silence as the parade continued, each lost in their own thoughts about service, sacrifice, and the invisible threads that connect one generation of warriors to the next. The sound of approaching helicopters made Eleanor's hands tremble slightly. Even after all these years, the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades could transport her back to that humid evening in Siu Chi when everything changed. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Sergeant Rodriguez noticed Eleanor's sudden tension. Eleanor forced a smile. "Just old memories, dear. Sometimes they have a way of catching up with you." The young sergeant nodded knowingly. She had seen that look before, in her grandmother's eyes, in her father's face when the fireworks got too loud on the 4th of July. The weight of experiences that couldn't easily be shared with those who hadn't been there. "My grandmother used to say that some memories never leave you," Rodriguez said softly. "She said they become part of who you are." Eleanor studied the young woman's profile as she watched the parade. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. Is she?" "She passed 5 years ago. Cancer." Rodriguez's voice carried a note of sadness. "But before she died, she made me promise something. She said if I ever met another Vietnam nurse, I should tell them something." "What's that?" "That their service mattered. That the soldiers they saved, the families they helped heal, those people remember. Even if the world forgot, the people whose lives they touched remember." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. She had carried the weight of those 3 years in Vietnam for so long, convinced that her service had been just a small footnote in a larger, tragic story. She had never received a hero's welcome, never been thanked for her service. She had simply come home, taken off her uniform, and tried to blend back into civilian life. "Tell me about your grandmother," Eleanor said, deflecting attention from herself. Rodriguez's face lit up. "Lieutenant Carmen Rodriguez, 12th Evacuation Hospital in Siu Chi. She used to tell me stories about the nurses who serve alongside her. Said they were the toughest women she'd ever known. Some of them were barely older than I am now, but they handled things that would break most people." Siu Chi, Eleanor's breath caught. She knew that name, knew it better than she wished she did. "The 12th Evac," Eleanor whispered. "I knew that unit." Rodriguez turned to face her fully. "You did?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "I was stationed there for 8 months in 1969. We worked together on some very difficult cases." The two women stared at each other, the noise of the parade fading into background as the significance of this coincidence settled over them. "Ma'am, what was your name?" "Your service name." "Lieutenant Eleanor Hartwell. but everyone called me Ellie. Rodriguez's eyes widened. Ellie? Oh my God. Ma'am, you're... She paused, composing herself. My grandmother talked about you. She told me about a nurse named Ellie who saved her life during a rocket attack on the hospital. Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly. She gripped the edge of her seat, memories flooding back with crystalline clarity. The night sky lit up by incoming fire, the controlled chaos of the medical compound. The sound of Carmen Rodriguez calling for help as shrapnel from a rocket had caught her in the shoulder while she was treating patients. Carmen, Eleanor whispered. She was trying to keep working even after she was hit. Stubborn as they come. That sounds like her, Rodriguez laughed, tears forming in her eyes. She said you tackled her to get her behind cover, then patched her up while rockets were still falling. She said you probably saved her life that night. Eleanor shook her head. We all looked out for each other. That's what we did. No, ma'am. According to my grandmother, you did more than that. She said you volunteered for the most dangerous rotations, always took the hardest cases, never complained even when you were working 18-hour shifts. Rodriguez paused, studying Eleanor's face. She said you were the bravest person she'd ever known. The conversation was interrupted by a change in the parade's rhythm. The ceremonial units were giving way to the active duty formations: Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard, all marching in precise formation down Pennsylvania Avenue. There's my unit, Rodriguez said, pointing to a group of soldiers in dress blues approaching their section. 3rd Infantry Regiment were the ones who guard the tomb of the unknown soldier. Eleanor watched as the formation approached, their bearing impeccable, their movements synchronized with military precision. These were America's elite ceremonial guard, the soldiers entrusted with the nation's most solemn duties. You should go join them, Eleanor said. Actually, ma'am, I'm not marching today. I'm on medical leave. Rodriguez gestured to her left leg, and Eleanor noticed for the first time the slight favor she gave it when sitting. IED in Afghanistan 6 months ago. Still recovering. Eleanor's nurse instincts kicked in immediately. Are you in pain? Do you need anything? Rodriguez smiled at the immediate concern in Eleanor's voice. Now I see where my grandmother got her description of you. Always putting others first. As the 3rd Infantry Regiment drew closer, Eleanor found herself studying their faces. Young, serious, dedicated, much like she had been all those years ago. She wondered what their stories were, what had brought them to military service, what they had seen and done in the name of duty. Ma'am, Rodriguez said suddenly, I need to tell you something else my grandmother said about you. Eleanor turned her attention back to the young sergeant. She said that after the war, she tried to find you. She wanted to thank you properly, to make sure you knew how much your service meant to the people you helped. But the records were complicated. She could never track you down. Eleanor felt a familiar pang of isolation. So many of the Vietnam nurses had come home to silence, their service unrecognized, their sacrifices forgotten. Many had changed their names, moved to different states, tried to put the war behind them. The sisterhood that had sustained them overseas had been scattered to the winds. She never forgot you, though, Rodriguez continued. Every Veterans Day, she would light a candle for the nurses she served with. She said she hoped someday the country would recognize what you all did over there. The 3rd Infantry Regiment was now directly in front of their section, their cadence steady and proud. Eleanor watched them pass, feeling a complex mix of pride and melancholy. These young soldiers represented the best of America's military tradition, but they were also a reminder of all the wars that had come and gone, all the young lives that had been shaped by conflict. As the last of the ceremonial guard passed, Eleanor noticed something unusual. The next unit was smaller than the others, but their formation was absolutely perfect. As they drew closer, she could see they were older soldiers, veterans who had been specially selected for this honor guard. That's the Veterans Honor Unit, Rodriguez explained. They only march in special ceremonies. Most of them are Medal of Honor recipients or soldiers who were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Eleanor watched the honor guard approach, noting the ribbons and decorations on their uniforms, the bearing that spoke of decades of service and sacrifice. These were America's heroes, the men and women who had gone above and beyond the call of duty. And then something extraordinary happened. The honor guard's commanding officer, a silver-haired colonel with more ribbons than Eleanor could count, suddenly called out a command that made every head in the formation turn toward the bleachers. Eyes, right. The entire honor guard turned their heads in unison toward Eleanor's section, their gaze seeming to focus directly on the elderly woman in the navy coat with the small medical pin on her lapel. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. This was unusual. Parade units typically only rendered honors to the reviewing stand where the dignitaries sat. Why were they looking at her? Rodriguez gripped Eleanor's arm gently. "Ma'am, I think they're looking at you." But before Eleanor could respond, something even more unprecedented happened. The commanding officer raised his hand, and the entire Veterans Honor Unit came to a complete stop. The crowd around them began to murmur in confusion. This wasn't part of the standard parade protocol. Units didn't stop mid-march, especially not elite ceremonial formations. Eleanor sat frozen in her seat, unsure of what was happening, but sensing that this moment was about to change everything. The silence that followed the honor guard's halt was deafening. Even the announcer seemed caught off guard, his voice trailing off mid-sentence as he tried to understand what was happening on Pennsylvania Avenue. Colonel James Morrison, the commanding officer of the Veterans Honor Unit, stood at attention in front of his formation. His weathered face bore the lines of 35 years of military service, including 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. But today, his focus was entirely on the elderly woman in Section C of the bleachers. "Ma'am," Rodriguez whispered urgently to Eleanor, "something's happening." Eleanor felt every eye in their section of the bleachers turning toward her. The family with the young children, the veteran couples, the teenagers who had been scrolling through their phones. All of them were now looking in her direction, trying to understand why an elite military unit had broken protocol to stop in front of a quiet elderly woman. Colonel Morrison took 3 precise steps toward the bleachers and came to attention. Then, in a voice that carried clearly across them all, he called out a command that sent shock waves through the crowd. "Veterans Honor Unit. Present. Arms." In perfect unison, every member of the honor guard brought their weapons to the present arms position, the military's highest form of salute. But they weren't saluting the flag or the reviewing stand. They were saluting Eleanor Hartwell. If this moment moved you, share it, because honoring those who served in silence is long overdue. Hit like if you believe no act of compassion should be forgotten. The crowd gasped. Several people began taking pictures and videos, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Eleanor sat motionless, her hands trembling as she stared at the formation of America's most decorated veterans paying her the highest military honor. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said softly, "you need to stand." Eleanor's legs felt weak, but Rodriguez helped her to her feet. As soon as Eleanor stood, the crowd around her began to rise as well, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Colonel Morrison held the salute for a full 30 seconds, an eternity in military time, before calling out another command. "Order! Arms!" The honor guard returned to attention, but they remained in position, their eyes still focused on Eleanor. Then Colonel Morrison did something that left the entire crowd speechless. He broke from formation, handed his ceremonial sword to his second-in-command, and began walking directly toward the bleachers. "Oh my God," Rodriguez breathed. "He's coming over here." The crowd parted automatically as Colonel Morrison approached the base of the bleacher section. He climbed the steps with measured precision, his dress uniform immaculate, his bearing commanding yet respectful. When he reached Eleanor's row, he came to attention once more and offered her a crisp military salute. "Lieutenant Eleanor Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed crowd. "It is my honor to finally meet you." Eleanor's mind reeled. How did he know her name? How did he know her rank? She hadn't used her military title in decades. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. How do you—" Colonel Morrison lowered his salute and spoke in a voice filled with respect and emotion. "Ma'am, my name is Colonel James Morrison. 43 years ago, I was Private Jimmy Morrison, 173rd Airborne Brigade. On December 15th, 1970, I was brought into the 12th Evacuation Hospital in Siuchi with severe wounds from an IED explosion. Eleanor's breath caught. December 15th, 1970. She remembered that day with painful clarity. It had been one of the worst days of her deployment. Multiple casualties from a coordinated attack, the hospital overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, everyone working beyond exhaustion. I was 19 years old, Morrison continued, and I was dying. Massive internal bleeding, multiple fractures, burns over 30% of my body. The doctor said I probably wouldn't make it through the night. The crowd around them had grown completely silent, straining to hear every word of this unexpected reunion. But there was this nurse. Morrison's voice grew stronger, more emotional. This incredibly brave woman who refused to give up on me. She stayed by my bedside for 3 straight days, monitoring my vitals, adjusting my medications, talking to me when I was conscious, making sure I knew I wasn't alone. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as the memories came flooding back. Private Morrison, she remembered him now. The young paratrooper with the infectious smile who had kept apologizing for being so much trouble, even while fighting for his life. "You saved my life, ma'am," Morrison said simply. "Not just medically, but spiritually. You gave me hope when I had none. You made me believe I could survive, that I had something to live for." "You were so young," Eleanor whispered, seeing the 19-year-old boy and the distinguished colonel standing before her. "I remember. You kept asking about your squad, about the other soldiers who were wounded in the attack." Morrison nodded. "You told me that caring about my brothers was what would keep me strong. You said that soldiers who fought for each other always found a way to make it home." The conversation was drawing an even larger crowd. People from other sections of the bleachers were leaving their seats to witness this extraordinary moment. News cameras that had been covering the parade were turning their lenses toward the impromptu reunion. "After I recovered," Morrison continued, "I tried to find you to thank you properly. But the war was ending, personnel were being reassigned, and the records were incomplete. I never gave up looking, though. And 2 weeks ago, through the Veterans Administration's new database project, I finally found you." Rodriguez squeezed Eleanor's arm gently. "Ma'am, that's why I was here today." Colonel Morrison reached out to my unit because he knew about my grandmother's connection to the 12th evac. He asked if there was any chance we could locate Lieutenant Eleanor Hartwell. Eleanor looked from Rodriguez to Morrison, beginning to understand. "You planned this?" Morrison nodded. "Ma'am, when I learned you had been attending these parades for 12 years, sitting alone, never being recognized for your service, I couldn't let that continue. You and the other nurses who served in Vietnam deserve better than to be forgotten." He gestured toward his honor guard, who remained at attention in the street below. Every man and woman in that formation volunteered to be here today when they learned we had found you. They wanted to honor not just you, but all the Vietnam nurses who never received the recognition they deserved. Eleanor was overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face. For so many years, she had carried the weight of her service in silence, believing that her contributions had been forgotten, that the sacrifices of the Vietnam nurses had been lost to history. "Ma'am," Morrison said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "there's one more thing." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a medal Eleanor had never seen before. It was beautiful, a silver star surrounded by a wreath, with a ribbon of deep blue and white. "This is the Vietnam Service Recognition Medal," Morrison explained. "It was created last year specifically to honor Vietnam veterans whose service was never properly recognized. You're the first nurse to receive it." Eleanor stared at the medal, unable to speak. Around them, the crowd had grown to several hundred people, all watching this unprecedented moment of recognition and gratitude. "Lieutenant Hartwell," Morrison said formally, "on behalf of a grateful nation, and in recognition of your extraordinary service, courage, and dedication during the Vietnam War, I present you with this medal. Your service saved lives, preserved hope, and exemplified the very best of American military tradition." As Morrison pinned the medal to Eleanor's coat, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. But the ceremony wasn't over yet. From a street below, a new sound emerged, the sound of hundreds of marching feet. Eleanor looked down to see that the Veterans Honor Unit had been joined by every other military formation in the parade. Active duty soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen, and Coast Guard personnel had broken from the parade route to form up in the street below the bleachers. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most moving moments in Veterans Day parade history. The sight below was unlike anything in parade history. What had started as a single honor guard's tribute had grown into something extraordinary. More than 1,000 service members from every branch of the military had spontaneously formed up in the street, creating a sea of dress uniforms stretching for 3 city blocks. Eleanor gripped the railing of the bleachers, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. Word of the tribute had spread through the parade formations via radio and cell phone, and unit after unit had requested permission to break protocol and join the salute. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, her own voice thick with emotion. "Look." Eleanor followed Rodriguez's gaze to see something that made her heart swell with indescribable pride. Mixed in among the young active duty personnel were hundreds of older veterans, men and women who had been watching the parade as spectators but had climbed down from the bleachers to join the formation. There were Vietnam veterans still carrying the invisible wounds of that conflict. Gulf War veterans who understood the complexity of coming home from an unpopular war. Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who knew what it meant to serve when the nation's attention was elsewhere. All of them standing together, united in their respect for a nurse who had served with quiet dignity and immeasurable courage. Colonel Morrison turned to address the crowd that had gathered around Eleanor's section of the bleachers. News crews were arriving, their cameras capturing every moment of this unprecedented display. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison's voice carried clearly through the amplification equipment that parade officials had quickly set up. "What you're witnessing today is more than just a tribute to one remarkable woman. This is our nation finally acknowledging a debt that should have been paid decades ago." He gestured toward Eleanor, who stood with tears streaming down her face, still wearing the Navy coat with her new medal pin beside the old medical caduceus. Lieutenant Eleanor Hartwell represents thousands of women who served with distinction during the Vietnam War. These nurses, medics, and support personnel worked under conditions that would challenge the strongest among us. They saved lives, provided comfort to the wounded, and gave hope to young soldiers who were far from home and facing unimaginable horrors. The crowd listened in rapt attention as Morrison continued. Many of these women came home to a nation that was conflicted about the war they had served in. Instead of ticker-tape parades and heroes' welcomes, they often faced indifference or even hostility. They were told to forget their service, to move on, to blend back into civilian life as if their sacrifice had never happened. Eleanor thought about those difficult years after coming home. The job interviews where potential employers seemed uncomfortable with her military service. The social gatherings where mention of Vietnam would create awkward silences. The gradual realization that her 3 years of service would become something she rarely talked about. But we remember, Morrison's voice grew stronger. The soldiers whose lives were saved remember. The families who got their sons and daughters back remember. And today, our nation remembers. He turned back to Eleanor. "Ma'am, would you be willing to say a few words?" Eleanor shook her head instinctively. She had never been comfortable being the center of attention, had never sought recognition for her service. But as she looked out at the sea of uniforms below, at the faces of young soldiers who reminded her so much of the patients she had cared for, she realized this moment wasn't really about her. Rodriguez sensed her hesitation and leaned close. "Ma'am, my grandmother always said that speaking your truth was part of the healing. Maybe this is your chance to speak for all the nurses who never got to tell their stories." Eleanor looked at the microphone that had been set up, then at the expectant faces around her. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. I'm not sure what to say," Eleanor began, her voice shaky but growing stronger. "For so many years, I believed that our service had been forgotten, that the work we did, the lives we tried to save, had somehow been lost in the larger story of that war." She paused, gathering her thoughts as she looked out at the assembled service members. But standing here today, seeing all of you, I realize that service is never really forgotten. It lives on in the people whose lives were touched, in the families who were reunited, in the values that get passed from one generation of warriors to the next. Her voice grew steadier as she continued. I want to speak for all the nurses who serve in Vietnam, many of whom are no longer with us. We didn't serve for recognition or parades. We served because young Americans needed us, and we couldn't turn away from that need. We served because in the midst of war's chaos and cruelty, someone had to be there to offer healing and hope. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. Some of those young soldiers called us angels, but we weren't angels. We were human beings doing an impossible job under unimaginable circumstances. We made mistakes, we lost patience, we struggled with doubts and fears and exhaustion. But we stayed. We stayed because that's what nurses do. We stay when staying is hard. We care when caring hurts. We heal when healing seems impossible. Eleanor's voice broke slightly as emotions overwhelmed her. To every veteran here today, and to every family member who has loved someone in uniform, I want you to know that your service matters. Your sacrifice has meaning. And even when it feels like the world has forgotten, there are people who remember. There are lives that were saved, families that were preserved, freedoms that were protected because you were willing to serve. She looked directly at the young faces in the formation below. And to the young service members who are carrying on that tradition today, remember that you are part of something larger than yourselves. You are the inheritors of a legacy of service that stretches back to the founding of our nation. Honor that legacy. Support each other. And never forget that what you do matters, even when, especially when, the gratitude isn't immediately visible. Eleanor stepped back from the microphone, emotionally drained but feeling lighter than she had in years. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The applause started with the veterans in formation and spread through the crowd like a wave. But this wasn't polite ceremony applause. This was heartfelt, sustained appreciation that seemed to echo off the buildings lining Pennsylvania Avenue. Then something remarkable happened. The young soldiers in the formation began to chant, not a military cadence, but something simpler and more powerful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The chant was picked up by the entire crowd. Thousands of voices united in gratitude. Veterans, families, tourists, children, all of them expressing appreciation that was decades overdue. Eleanor stood at the railing, overwhelmed by the outpouring of respect and love. Rodriguez stood beside her, tears in her eyes as she thought about her grandmother and all the other Vietnam nurses who had carried their service in silence for so long. As the chanting continued, Colonel Morrison approached Eleanor one final time. "Ma'am," he said, "there's one more thing the Honor Guard would like to do, if you're willing." Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't imagine what else could possibly happen on this extraordinary day. Morrison raised his hand, and gradually the crowd quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "it is traditional in military ceremonies to end with a moment of silence for our fallen comrades. Today, we'd like to observe that moment in honor of all the Vietnam nurses who gave their lives in service to our nation, and for all the veterans who came home but have since passed on." The silence that followed was profound. In that moment, Eleanor felt the presence of all her sisters in service, the nurses who had died in Vietnam, those who had struggled with the war's aftermath, and those who had lived full lives but never received the recognition they deserved. As the moment of silence ended, Eleanor realized that this day had changed something fundamental, not just for her, but for the nation's understanding of service and sacrifice. The story of the Vietnam nurses would no longer be a footnote in history. It would be part of the larger narrative of American courage and dedication. The parade would eventually resume, but this moment would be remembered long after the last unit had passed the reviewing stand. It would be shared on social media, discussed in living rooms, and retold in families for generations to come. But for Eleanor, the most important part wasn't the public recognition. It was the knowledge that the young soldiers she had cared for all those years ago had remembered. They had grown up, built families, served their communities, and passed on the values that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The healing that had begun in a field hospital in Vietnam had finally come full circle. In the days following the parade, Eleanor's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The video of her recognition had gone viral within hours, shared millions of times across social media platforms with captions like, "Finally, and this is what a real hero looks like." Eleanor sat in her small Arlington apartment, surrounded by hundreds of letters, emails, and packages that had arrived from around the world. Her quiet existence had been shattered, replaced by a whirlwind of interview requests, speaking invitations, and heartfelt messages from grateful veterans and their families. Mrs. Hartwell, Eleanor's neighbor, Janet Shun, knocked softly on the door. "There's another news truck outside, and a reporter from CBS is asking if she can interview you." Eleanor sighed, looking at the stack of unopened correspondence on her kitchen table. She had been fielding calls and visitors for 3 days straight, each one wanting to hear her story, to understand what the Vietnam nurses had experienced. "Tell them I'll speak with them later, dear. I'm expecting someone important this afternoon." Janet nodded and left Eleanor alone with her memories and the overwhelming realization that her story had struck a chord with people she'd never imagined would care. The apartment's phone rang again. It had been ringing almost constantly since the parade. Eleanor let it go to the answering machine, but couldn't help listening to the message. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Sarah Martinez from the Vietnam Women's Memorial Foundation. We've been trying to reach you about a speaking engagement at the Wall next month. Please call us back when you can. What you did at the parade has opened doors for all of us." Eleanor had heard of the Vietnam Women's Memorial, the bronze sculpture near the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall that honored the women who had served. She had visited it once, years ago, but it felt like an outsider even there, convinced that her service wasn't significant enough to warrant recognition. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Eleanor opened it to find Sergeant Rodriguez standing in the hallway, but she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that looked remarkably familiar. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said with a smile, "I'd like you to meet my aunt, Patricia Rodriguez." Eleanor studied the woman's face, and suddenly recognition dawned. "Carmen," she whispered. "Carmen Rodriguez." Patricia, formerly Lieutenant Carmen Rodriguez, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Hello, Ellie. I've been looking for you for 43 years. The two women embraced in Eleanor's doorway, both of them crying as decades of separation melted away. Eleanor had thought all of her Vietnam sisters were lost to her forever, scattered by time and circumstance. "How did you find me?" Eleanor asked as they settled in her living room. "The same way everyone else has," Patricia laughed. "That video has been everywhere. Maria called me the moment she realized who you were, and I got on the first plane from Phoenix." Eleanor looked from Patricia to Rodriguez, seeing the family resemblance more clearly now. "So you're both?" "My grandmother and my aunt," Rodriguez explained. "Grandma Carmen passed away 5 years ago, but Aunt Patricia has been carrying on her mission to find the nurses she served with." Patricia nodded. "Carmen made me promise to keep looking. She kept detailed records, photographs, everything she could remember about the women she served with in Vietnam. She never stopped believing that someday we'd be reunited." She pulled out an old photo album and opened it to a page that made Eleanor gasp. There, in faded color, were pictures of the 12th Evacuation Hospital nursing staff. Young women in military fatigues, their faces serious but determined. "That's you." Patricia pointed to a slim young woman with short brown hair and tired eyes. "That's all of us." Eleanor stared at the photographs, seeing herself as she had been more than 50 years ago. The young woman in the picture looked so confident, so ready to take on the world. Had she really been that brave? "Look at this one." Patricia turned the page to reveal a group photo taken outside the hospital. "This was taken the day before the rocket attack that wounded me. Do you remember?" Eleanor's finger traced the faces in the photograph. Linda Morrison, she was from Ohio. She went home early after she was injured in that helicopter crash. And Sarah Chun, our head nurse. She was so tough, never let us give up on a patient. "Sarah's still alive," Patricia said softly. "She lives in California now. She's been organizing reunions for years, but could never find you. The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. All these years, she had assumed she was alone, that the bonds forged in Vietnam had been permanently severed. But her sisters had been looking for her, trying to rebuild the connections that had sustained them through the war. "There are 12 of us still alive," Patricia continued. "We've been meeting every year on December 15th, the anniversary of that rocket attack. We call it our second birthday, because we all survived something that should have killed us." Eleanor remembered that night with painful clarity. The rockets had come in waves, targeting the hospital complex. They had continued treating patients, even as explosions rocked the building around them. "I'd like you to come to this year's reunion," Patricia said. "It's in 2 weeks in Washington. The others, they need to see you, Ellie. They need to know you're okay." Before Eleanor could respond, Rodriguez's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She looked at the screen, and her expression changed. "Ma'am, this is Colonel Morrison. He says it's urgent." Eleanor took the phone, curious about what could be so important. "Lieutenant Hartwell." Morrison's voice was excited. "I hope you can forgive the intrusion, but something extraordinary has happened. Since the parade, the Veterans Administration has been flooded with requests from Vietnam nurses wanting to register for benefits and recognition they never claimed." Eleanor listened, intrigued. "More than that," Morrison continued, "we've had over 1,000 Vietnam veterans reach out to us, wanting to find nurses who treated them. They want to say thank you, to share their stories, to let these women know how their service affected their lives." Eleanor felt tears welling up again. 1,000, and growing every hour. "Ma'am, what happened at that parade has opened something up in this country. People are finally ready to acknowledge what the Vietnam nurses did, and the nurses are finally ready to step forward." Patricia was listening to Eleanor's side of the conversation, and she was nodding with understanding. "Colonel Morrison," Eleanor said, "there's something you should know. I'm not alone anymore. The nurses are finding each other." After Eleanor hung up, the 3 women sat in comfortable silence, each contemplating the magnitude of what was happening. A simple moment of recognition at a parade had unleashed decades of suppressed gratitude and delayed healing. "Aunt Patricia," Rodriguez said suddenly, "didn't Grandma Carmen always say that one day the country would be ready to hear our stories?" Patricia smiled. She did. She used to say that healing takes time, and that truth has a way of surfacing when people are ready to accept it. Eleanor thought about all the years she had kept her service to herself, all the time she had downplayed her experiences or changed the subject when people asked about her past. She had been protecting herself from a world that seemed indifferent to her sacrifice. But in doing so, she had also been protecting the world from truths it wasn't ready to hear. "I want to do more," Eleanor said suddenly. "I want to help other nurses tell their stories. I want to make sure that what happened to us, the silence, the isolation, doesn't happen to the women who serve in Iraq and Afghanistan." Rodriguez leaned forward, interested. "What do you have in mind?" Eleanor stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the street where news vans were still parked, waiting for another chance to interview her. "I want to use this attention for something bigger than just my story. I want to create a foundation that helps military nurses and medics transition back to civilian life. I want to make sure they get the mental health support they need, the recognition they deserve, and most importantly, the connection to other veterans who understand what they've been through." Patricia clapped her hands together. "Ellie, that's exactly what Carmen would have wanted. She always said our experiences were too valuable to keep to ourselves. But I don't know how to start something like that," Eleanor admitted. "I'm just a retired nurse from Arlington." Rodriguez smiled. "Ma'am, with respect, you're not just anything. You're the woman who sparked a national conversation about military nursing. You're the person thousands of veterans are looking for. And now you have the platform to make real change happen." Over the next several hours, the 3 women began sketching out plans for what would become the Vietnam Nurses Legacy Foundation. They talked about Eleanor's upcoming reunion with her fellow nurses, about the speaking engagements she was being offered, about the possibility of working with the VA to better serve female veterans. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in decades. For so long, she had seen her Vietnam service as a closed chapter in her life, something that was finished and filed away. But now she realized that her service was just beginning its second act. The phone rang again, and this time Eleanor answered herself. "Hello, this is Eleanor Hartwell." "Mrs. Hartwell, this is President Johnson's office calling." Eleanor nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "The president would like to invite you to the White House next week for a ceremony honoring Vietnam nurses. Would you be available?" Eleanor looked at Patricia and Rodriguez, both of whom were staring at her with wide eyes. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice steady and strong. "Yes, I'll be there." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor realized that the quiet woman who had sat alone at the parade was gone forever. In her place was someone who had found her voice, her purpose, and most importantly, her sisters. The healing that had begun in Vietnam was finally complete, but the work of honoring and supporting military nurses was just beginning. The East Room of the White House had been transformed for the ceremony. 68 Vietnam nurses sat in the front rows, many of them meeting for the first time in over 50 years. Eleanor looked around at these women, her sisters in service, and marveled at how they had all changed and yet remained fundamentally the same. Sarah Chun, now 79 and using a cane, had flown in from San Francisco. Linda Morrison, the nurse from Ohio, had brought her daughter and granddaughter. Patricia Rodriguez sat beside Eleanor, both women wearing their original service pins alongside the new Vietnam Service Recognition medals they would receive today. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president's aide announced, "please rise for the President of the United States." Eleanor stood with the others, her heart pounding as she prepared for a moment she could never have imagined during those long nights in Siuchi. President Martinez entered the room with military bearing. She was the first female president and a Navy veteran herself. Her presence added special significance to this ceremony honoring women who had served when female military service was far less recognized. "Please be seated," President Martinez said as she approached the podium. "Today we gather to correct a historical oversight that has persisted for far too long." Eleanor listened as the president spoke about the courage of military nurses, about the unique challenges they faced, and about the nation's debt to women who had served with distinction in every American conflict. The women we honor today served during one of our nation's most difficult periods. They volunteered to go into harm's way, not to carry weapons, but to heal the wounded and comfort the dying. They worked under conditions that would challenge the most seasoned professionals, often while under enemy fire. The president's words were interrupted by spontaneous applause from the audience, which included families of the nurses, veteran organizations, and current military leadership. But perhaps most remarkably, President Martinez continued. These women came home and continued to serve their communities as nurses, teachers, mothers, and leaders, often without recognition for their military service. Today, we remedy that oversight. One by one, the president called each nurse forward to receive their medal and a personal thank you. Eleanor watched as her sisters approached the podium. Women in their 70s and 80s who moved with the quiet dignity that had sustained them through war and decades of civilian life. When Eleanor's name was called, she walked forward on legs that felt surprisingly steady. As President Martinez placed the medal around her neck, she whispered something that only Eleanor could hear. "My mother was a Navy nurse in Korea. She would have been proud to see this day." Eleanor returned to her seat, emotionally overwhelmed but also profoundly satisfied. This ceremony wasn't just about recognition. It was about healing, closure, and the nation's willingness to embrace a more complete understanding of military service. After the formal ceremony, the nurses gathered in the White House Rose Garden for a reception. Eleanor found herself surrounded by women sharing stories, laughing about shared memories, and marveling at the paths their lives had taken. "Ellie," Sarah Chun approached with a manila folder in her hand. "I brought something I thought you should see." Sarah opened the folder to reveal letters, dozens of them, handwritten on various types of paper, some obviously very old. "What are these?" Eleanor asked. "Letters from soldiers we treated. Their families have been sending them to the Vietnam Women's Memorial for years, hoping they would somehow reach us. This one is addressed to you specifically." Eleanor took the letter Sarah indicated. The envelope was worn and yellowed, postmarked 1995. Her name was written in careful script. Lieutenant Eleanor Hartwell, Vietnam nurse. With shaking hands, Eleanor opened the letter and began to read. Asterisk, Dear Lieutenant Hartwell, you probably don't remember me, but you saved my life in December 1970 at the 12th Evacuation Hospital. I was Private Danny Foster, 1st Cavalry Division. I had taken shrapnel from a rocket attack and was in pretty bad shape. You stayed with me during my first night there when the doctors weren't sure I was going to make it. You kept talking to me, telling me about your hometown in Virginia, asking me about my family back in Iowa. You made me believe I had something to live for. I've been trying to find you for 25 years to tell you that I did have something to live for. I came home, went to college on a GI Bill, became a teacher, got married, and had 3 kids. My oldest son is in the Army now. He's a medic, inspired by the stories I told him about the nurses who saved my life. I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I had to try. You gave me my life back, and I've tried to live it in a way that would make you proud. Thank you for your service, your compassion, and your refusal to give up on a scared kid from Iowa. With eternal gratitude, Danny Foster asterisk. Eleanor's hands trembled as she finished reading. She looked up to find Sarah watching her with knowing eyes. There are 47 more letters addressed to you specifically, Sarah said gently, and hundreds more for the other nurses. Families have been looking for us for decades. Eleanor thought about all the young faces she had cared for, all the soldiers whose names she had tried to remember over the years. To learn that they had remembered her, that they had built lives and families and careers after their service, filled her with a joy she couldn't adequately express. There's something else, Sarah continued. The Vietnam Women's Memorial Foundation wants to create a digital archive where veterans can submit stories about the nurses who treated them. They want to call it the Eleanor Hartwell Living Memorial Project. Eleanor shook her head. It shouldn't be named after me. It should honor all of us. That's exactly what Carmen Rodriguez's granddaughter said you would say. Patricia Rodriguez appeared beside them, smiling. That's why we're going to call it the Sisters in Service Archive. It will honor all the women who served as military nurses, not just in Vietnam, but in every conflict. As the reception continued, Eleanor found herself in conversation with Colonel Morrison, who had coordinated the White House ceremony. Ma'am, Morrison said, I have one more surprise for you. He gestured toward the Rose Garden entrance, where a group of young people in military uniforms was approaching. Eleanor recognized them as current military nurses and medics, but she didn't understand their connection to the ceremony. These are members of the Morrison Foundation Scholarship Program, Colonel Morrison explained. It's a program I started 10 years ago to provide education funding for military nurses and medics. Every recipient learns about the Vietnam nurses as part of their orientation. A young Army nurse stepped forward. Ma'am, my name is Captain Jennifer Martinez. I just wanted you to know that your story has been part of our training for years. You and the other Vietnam nurses represent the standard we all strive to meet. Eleanor looked at these young service members, confident, well-trained, properly equipped, and felt a deep satisfaction. These were the inheritors of the tradition she and her sisters had helped establish. Captain Martinez, Eleanor said, what do you need from us? How can we help you succeed in ways that we weren't helped? The young officer's answer was immediate. Tell us your stories. All of them. The successes and the failures. The moments of courage and the times you were afraid. Help us understand not just how to be good nurses, but how to be good military nurses. Eleanor nodded, understanding that this was her true mission now. Not just to receive recognition for past service, but to use her experience to guide the next generation. As the ceremony wound down, Eleanor found herself standing alone in the Rose Garden, looking back at the White House where she had just been honored by her nation's highest leadership. 6 months ago, she had been an invisible elderly woman sitting alone at a parade. Today, she was the catalyst for a national conversation about military nursing and the focal point of efforts to support current and future service members. But the most important transformation wasn't in how others saw her. It was in how she saw herself. For the first time in decades, Eleanor Hartwell felt truly proud of her service, truly connected to her military family, and truly optimistic about the future. The parade that had changed everything was just the beginning. The real work, honoring the past while building support for future generations of military nurses, was happening now in conversations like the one she'd just had with Captain Martinez, in initiatives like the Sisters in Service Archive, and in the simple act of Vietnam nurses finally telling their stories. As Eleanor prepared to leave the White House, Patricia Rodriguez joined her one final time. Carmen always said that everything happens in its own time. Patricia reflected. Maybe we had to wait 50 years for this recognition because the country needed time to be ready to hear our stories properly. Eleanor nodded, thinking about the young soldiers she had treated, the colleagues she had served with, and the generations of military nurses who would follow in their footsteps. "I think you're right," Eleanor said, "and I think we're ready to tell them." The two women walked out of the White House together, no longer alone, no longer forgotten, no longer silent about their service. Behind them, a new chapter in the story of American military nursing was beginning, one that would honor the past while building bridges to the future. The parade had ended, but the march toward recognition, healing, and support for military nurses would continue for generations to come. And Eleanor Hartwell, the woman who had once sat alone in the bleachers, would be leading that march, surrounded by her sisters in service and the young nurses they had inspired. 1 year later, Eleanor stood at the podium of the newly constructed Vietnam Nurses Memorial Center in Arlington, Virginia. The facility housed the Sisters in Service Archive, a counseling center for military nurses, and a scholarship program that had already awarded grants to over 200 current and former service members. In the audience sat her Vietnam sisters, their families, current military nurses, and hundreds of veterans whose lives had been touched by military medical personnel. The room was filled with connection, purpose, and hope. "When I sat alone at that parade," Eleanor began, "I thought my story was ending. I thought my service was a closed chapter, meaningful only to me and the memories I carried." She paused, looking out at the faces that had become so familiar over the past year. "But I learned that no service is ever really finished. Every act of courage, every moment of compassion, every decision to stay when staying is hard. These things ripple forward through time, touching lives in ways we can't imagine." Eleanor smiled, thinking about the letters that still arrived daily, the reunions that were happening across the country, and the young nurses who were serving with a confidence and support system that she and her generation had never known. Today, no military nurse serves alone. Today, every act of healing is recognized and honored. And today, we remember that the greatest tribute to those who served before us is to ensure that those who serve after us never feel forgotten. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but more importantly, it was filled with understanding. The invisible had been made visible, the forgotten had been remembered, and the silent had found their voice. Eleanor Hartwell's story had become everyone's story, a reminder that heroism often wears no uniform, carries no weapon, and asks for no recognition. Sometimes it simply sits quietly in the bleachers, carrying the weight of service with dignity and grace, waiting for the moment when a grateful nation is ready to say 2 simple words: "Thank you." If you've ever known someone who served without recognition, tell us their name below. Let them be seen. Tag someone who should hear this. The silence ends now. On this channel, we share stories that history tried to forget, stories of quiet heroes and lasting courage. If that speaks to you, turn on the bell and walk this journey with us.